I wiped the grease from my hands onto the already filthy rag and straightened up my back, cracking like dry wood. The watermill beside the goat pen had been fighting me for 3 days. The shaft was warped. The stones ground unevenly, and every time the wind shifted, the whole contraption groaned like an old man dying. Still, it was better than letting the grain rot in the sacks. 27 years I had lived on this patch of earth at the very edge of Scarlow, where the black wheat fields met the wild foothills. My parents had left me the small wooden house, with its steep thatch roof, the sagging barn, the half-dozen stubborn goats, and this stubborn mill. Nothing more. No title, no soldiers, no powerful friends. Only the stubborn reputation that I would not sell the land, no matter how many silver coins the greater lords dangled in front of me. The afternoon sun beat down heavy and dusty. The last of the summer heat clung to the air like a wet cloak. Around me the field stretched out in dull gold, the wind moving through the stalks with a dry whisper. The goats bleated once or twice, then fell quiet again. No one ever came out here unless they had to. That was how I liked it. Then I heard the crunch of iron-rimmed wheels on the stony track that led up from the main road. I looked up sharply. A black carriage, well-made and expensive, rolled to a stop in front of the yard. The horses were tall and glossy, the kind only wealthy houses kept. The door opened. A woman stepped down. Woman. She was orc, that much was unmistakable, tall, broad-shouldered, green-skinned. But she looked nothing like the orc warriors I had sometimes seen at the border markets. No dented armor, no heavy axe, no trail dust. She wore a fine gray wool cloak trimmed in silver, a wide belt set with dark stones, and tall leather boots that were still clean despite the muddy yard. Her deep copper hair was bound neatly at the nape of her neck. What struck me most were her eyes, sharp-tired and carrying the look of someone who had not slept well for many nights. She walked straight toward me without hesitation. "Are you Edrin Vale?" Her voice was low-clear and carried the slight accent of the northern hills. I nodded, still holding the greasy rag. She drew a slow breath as if steeling herself, then looked me dead in the eye. "I need a husband by tomorrow." The rag slipped from my fingers and fell into the dirt. For a moment, the only sound was the wind moving through the wheat. My mind raced through every possible meaning, a cruel jest, a trap, a fever dream brought on by too much sun. She did not smile. She did not blink. When I finally found my tongue, I asked you, "What my name is Kalira Thornvek," she said, "granddaughter of the late Lord Thornvek of the Thornvek Holdings. His will is clear, the heir must be wed before their 29th birthday or the entire estate passes to my cousin Rygar. Tomorrow is the final day." She spoke as if the words cost her something. I wiped my hands uselessly on my tunic. "And why, in the name of the gods, would you come to a miller's farm to ask a stranger to marry you?" Kalira glanced once at the fields, then back at me. "Your land borders the eastern edge of the Thornvek Holdings. You have no lord above you, no debts to any great house, and everyone in the border villages knows you cannot be bought with coin. That is rare." She paused. "My previous betrothed abandoned me the moment I refused to sign agreements that would force small farmers to sell their land. Rhaegar is waiting for me to fail. If I do, he will swallow every independent holding around here, including yours." The wind seemed colder suddenly. I looked at her. Really looked. The fine cloak, the tired eyes, the way her hands stayed perfectly still at her sides, even though I could see the tension in her shoulders. This was no game. I shook my head slowly. I won't marry anyone just to put my name on a piece of parchment and then be tossed aside when the danger passes. If I'm to stand as your husband even for a day, then it has to be real." Kalira's brows drew together, waiting. I met her gaze and said the only thing that felt true in that moment. "So if you want this, you will have to come and live here. In this house. With me. Not as a guest, not in secret. You will live here like a wife." For the first time since she had stepped from the carriage, something flickered across her face, surprise, perhaps even disbelief. She studied me for a long, heavy moment as though weighing every possible consequence. Then she gave a single, decisive nod. We clasped hands right there in the dusty yard between the goat pen and the broken mill. Her grip was strong, warm, and steady. Neither of us knew it then, but that was the moment everything changed. The next morning, the black carriage returned before the sun had fully cleared the hills. I stood on the porch in my only clean tunic heart, hammering harder than it had when I faced down a boar last winter. Kalira stepped down wearing the same gray cloak, but her face looked even more tired, as if she had not slept at all. We climbed inside without a word. The driver cracked the reins and the wheels began to roll toward Gray Hollow, the district seat 3 hours away. The road wound through dry fields and low stone walls. Neither of us spoke for a long time. The silence felt heavier than any accusation. At last I said, "This is not how anyone dreams of a wedding." Kalira looked out the window. Dreams are luxuries for people who have time. I do not. The town hall of Gray Hollow was a squat stone building with a slate roof and a carved wooden door that creaked like an old gate. Inside, a bored clerk waited behind a high desk. A magistrate in plain black robes stood beside him. 2 witnesses had already arrived, a thin lawyer in Thornveck colors for Kalira and old Thomas, my nearest neighbor who had helped my father raise the barn 20 years ago. Tomas gave me a single nod. Single. His eyes full of questions he was too polite to ask. The ceremony was over in minutes. We stood side by side. The magistrate read the short binding words required by the border law that joined human and orc holdings. No flowers, no music, no family. Only the dry voice of the law and the scratch of quills. At the end, he tied a simple silver cord around our left wrists, nodding it once. We repeated the ancient phrases, "I take you as my spouse before gods and men," and signed our names on thick parchment. My hand shook slightly when I wrote Edrin Vale. Kalira's was steady. When the cord was cut and the paper sealed with wax, something inside me shifted. There was no going back now. I was married. On the long ride home, the silence returned, but it felt different. I cleared my throat. "If you are going to live in my house, there will be rules," I said. "No army of servants turning the place into a manor, no treating this as a temporary camp. If you step through my door as my wife, you live as my wife every day, every chore, every meal, no hiding." Kalira studied me for a long moment. Agreed. "And my rules are simple. You do not speak for me in matters of the Thornveck holdings. When outsiders come asking, we tell the same story. We stand together or we fall together." I nodded. The bargain felt heavier than the silver cord had. That evening she returned to the city to settle her affairs. I spent the night sharpening tools and trying not to think too hard about what I had done. She arrived again the following morning just after dawn. The same black carriage rolled into the yard, but this time 2 large chests and a heavy trunk of documents followed her. She looked exhausted, shoulders tight. Before I could ask, she spoke. "Rhaegar has already begun. He has men asking questions in every village between here and the hills. If they smell a false marriage, he will drag us before the council and tear the will apart." I carried her chests inside without comment. The house had only 2 proper rooms, the main chamber where I slept and the smaller room at the back that had once belonged to my parents. I had kept it exactly as they left it, bed made, wooden chest clothes, dried lavender still hanging from the rafters. Opening that door felt like opening a grave. Dust floated in the slanted light. I set the chests down gently. Kalira stepped across the threshold as though the floor might break. She touched nothing. She simply looked around, taking in the plain quilt, the single shelf of books, the small window that faced the wheat. For the first time since we met, her voice softened. "Thank you," she said. "This room, it matters to you." I shrugged, suddenly awkward. "It's yours now. We share the rest of the house." The first days were painfully awkward. I rose before dawn, milked the goats, checked the mill-mended fences. Kalira rose, later brewed strong tea, spread papers across the table, and spoke quietly into a small sending stone to distant lawyers. Our conversations were short and practical. "Where's the extra oil for the lamp? I'll mend the water trough this afternoon." "Leave the barn door latched, or the goats will wander." "Your man from the city arrives when we circled each other like wary animals sharing a small cave." On the 3rd morning, I was wrestling a broken fence post back into the ground when Kalira appeared carrying a bucket of water. She set it down without being asked, rolled up her sleeves, and reached for the 2nd post. Her fine cloak was gone. She wore a simple linen shirt and trousers she must have found in one of the chests. The shirt was too large for her, the sleeves rolled high. She looked almost ordinary. She was clumsy with the tools. The post slipped, scraping her palm. She hissed a sharp orc word under her breath and laughed once at herself, a short, surprised sound. I found myself smiling before I could stop it. That evening she tried to cook. The pot of stew scorched black at the bottom. I teased her gently. She glared, then laughed again, louder this time. We scraped what we could onto plates and ate in the firelight. The house felt smaller, warmer. The marriage had begun as ink on paper and desperate necessity. But somewhere between a bucket of water, a scraped hand, and burnt stew, it had started to feel like the beginning of something real. The day settled into a strange rhythm after that. We no longer circled each other like strangers forced to share a roof. The conversations grew longer, quieter, and no longer only about hiding the truth from the outside world. One evening after the work was done, we sat on the narrow wooden porch behind the house. The sun had dropped behind the hills, painting the wheat fields in soft gold and shadow. A cool wind moved through the stalks. Kalira held a mug of tea between her hands, staring out at the land as if seeing it for the first time. She spoke without looking at me. My grandfather built the Thornveck holdings for one reason only. He wanted to protect the small farms. He lent seed and livestock at fair interest. He kept the granaries full even in the lean years so no one starved when the snow came early. He believed the border lands should belong to the people who worked them, not to lords who never touched soil. She paused. Rygar believes the opposite. He wants to swallow every independent holding force farmers to sell plant, quick profit crops that bleed the earth dry in 5 seasons. If he takes control, this entire region will be turned into one vast estate worked by tenants who own nothing. Including your land, Edrin. I listened without interrupting. The wind tugged at her copper hair. I did not come here only for myself, she continued. I came because if I lose, hundreds of families lose with me. Your farm is only the closest. There are dozens more just like it. I turned the mug in my hands, feeling the warmth seep into my palms. For the first time, I understood the weight she carried. It was not just pride or inheritance. It was the lives of people she had never met. I set my mug down. My parents refused to sell this land for the same reason I said. Every spring, some lord's agent would ride up with offers and threats. My father would listen, then send them away. He said if we sold once, we would never stop selling pieces of ourselves until nothing was left. They died poor because of that choice. But they died on land that still belonged to them. I stayed for the same reason. I would rather scrape by and call this soil mine than grow fat on coin that came from betraying what they fought to keep. Kalira turned to look at me fully. Her eyes were steady, no longer guarded. So we are guarding the same thing, she said quietly. Only the scale is different. After that night, the walls between us thinned. Bad news arrived soon enough. Rygar's men had begun spreading rumors in the villages. They said I was a greedy farmer who had tricked an orc heiress into marriage for her wealth. They said Kalira had staged the wedding to cheat the will. Leaf bills in the market squares printed the lies in cheap ink. I found one nailed to my own gatepost the next morning. I tore it down and burned it in the yard. Kalira watched the paper curl and blacken. Then she did something I did not expect. She called for her sending stone and spoke clearly in front of me. Tell every steward and every factor my husband is Edrin Vale. Anyone who speaks against him speaks against me. If they insult him, they insult the future of Thornveck itself. She said it without raising her voice. When she lowered the stone, her gaze met mine. I will not let them turn what we are building into a joke. That same afternoon, she followed me into the fields. I showed her how to read the color of the wheat, how to tell when the heads were heavy enough to cut. She listened, then asked sharp questions about yields and soil. In return, she taught me how to read the contracts and ledgers that had always looked like enemy code to me. We worked side by side under the sun until our shirts stuck to our backs and our hands were brown with dirt. There were small moments that lingered. One night I found her asleep at the table, head resting on a stack of papers. I fetched the thick wool blanket from my parents' room and laid it gently over her shoulders. When she woke the next morning, she did not mention the blanket, but she looked at me longer than usual across the breakfast table. Another evening I came in from the barn to find her stirring a pot with careful concentration, trying once more to make the stew I liked. When she saw me, she smiled a small private smile, meant only for the two of us. I felt something warm and unfamiliar unfold in my chest. The marriage had begun as ink and necessity, but somewhere between shared labor, burnt stew, and quiet truths, spoken under starlight, it had become something stronger. We were no longer two people pretending for the sake of a will. We had become allies who chose to stand together, not because the law demanded it, but because we had begun to want the same future. Rygar did not wait long to show his teeth. One morning, I woke to the sound of water rushing where it should not have been. I pulled on my boots and ran to the fields. The main irrigation pipe that carried water from the spring to the young wheat had been cut clean through with a sharp blade. Water poured uselessly into a muddy ditch, flooding half an acre of new growth and turning good soil into useless sludge. The crop that should have fed us through winter was already wilting under the early sun. I stood there with my hands clenched, knowing this was no accident. Kalira appeared beside me moments later, still in the linen shirt she slept in. She took one look at the broken pipe, the ruined field, and the anger that tightened her jaw. Without a word, she rolled up her sleeves, stepped into the mud, and helped me dig out the damaged section. Her fine boots sank to the ankles, mud streaked her arms and stained the front of her shirt, but she did not complain. We worked side by side until the sun was high, splicing new wood and clay into the pipe-hauling rocks to reinforce the banks. By the time the water flowed again, we were both filthy and exhausted. She wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist and looked at me. "This is only the beginning," she said quietly. She was right. The next days brought smaller wounds. Strange riders appeared on the road watching the farm from a distance. Merchants who had bought my grain for years suddenly found excuses not to come. One letter arrived by Raven unsigned warning that anyone who did business with the Orc's pet farmer would regret it. Rumors spread faster than fire. I had forced Kalira into marriage she had bought me with gold. Our union was a sham to cheat the law. I burned every letter. Kalira answered each rumor with cold public statements carried by her messengers. Still the whispers grew. Then came the night that changed everything. A storm rolled down from the northern hills, heavy with rain and wind. I could not sleep. Something in the air felt wrong. I rose, pulled on my cloak, and stepped outside to check the barn. The moment I opened the door, I smelled its smoke, thick and oily, coming from the grain store behind the house. I shouted for Kalira and ran. Flames licked up the side of the wooden storehouse where we kept the winter seed. The storm had masked the fire until it was too late. I grabbed buckets, filled them from the trough, and threw water at the blaze. Rain lashed my face. Smoke burned my eyes and throat. Kalira appeared at my side, carrying another bucket, her hair plastered to her head. We fought the fire together, shouting over the wind until the roof collapsed in a roar of sparks. When the last flame died, the storehouse was a blackened ruin. Most of the seed was lost. My left arm and shoulder were burned where a falling beam had caught me. I dropped to my knees in the mud, coughing the rain mixing with the soot on my face. Kalira knelt beside me. Her hands shook as she tore a strip from her own cloak to wrap my burns. For the first time since I had met her, her voice cracked. "This is my fault," she whispered. "He is hurting you because of me." I caught her wrist, forcing her to look at me. Rain streamed down both our faces. "Stop," I said. "This stopped being about a piece of paper the moment you stepped into the mud with me. The moment you burned your hands trying to cook stew. The moment you stood in front of your stewards and named me your husband in front of the world. This is our fight now, not yours." "Ours." She stared at me for a long time, rain dripping from her lashes. Then she leaned forward and rested her forehead against mine just for a moment. Her breath trembled. "I have spent my whole life surrounded by people who stood beside me only for what they could gain," she said softly. "You are the first who chose to stand in the fire with me when you could have walked away. We stayed like that while the storm slowly eased, The smell of wet ash and burnt grain hung in the air, but something else had shifted between us, something deeper than necessity, deeper than the will of a dead lord. The next morning, a raven brought the final summons. The Thornveck Council demanded we appear in 2 days to prove our marriage was real. If they ruled against us, Kylera would lose everything. I could be charged with conspiracy. We had 2 days left. That night we sat on the porch again, the ruin of the storehouse still smoking behind us. I took her hand without thinking. Her fingers closed around mine. Whatever the council decides, I said, I am not letting you go back to being alone in that world, not anymore. Kylera did not answer with words. She simply tightened her grip and leaned her shoulder against mine. In the quiet dark, with the scent of rain and ash still on our clothes, we made our choice. The marriage had never been a contract. It had become a promise. We rode into Lindor Keep 2 days later under a sky the color of old iron. The black carriage rattled over cobblestones, worn smooth by centuries of boots and wheels. Kylera sat beside me in silence, her hand resting near mine on the seat, though we did not touch. The burns on my arm still throbbed beneath fresh bandages, but the pain felt distant now. All that mattered was the hall waiting ahead. The great council chamber of the Thornveck Holdings was larger than I had imagined, a long stone room lit by tall, narrow windows and hanging iron braziers. Benches on both sides were filled with stewards' factors, lawyers, and distant relatives. Every eye turned toward us as we entered. At the far end, behind a heavy oak table carved with the Thornveck crest, sat the 5 council elders. And to their right, smiling like a man who already owned the room, was Rygar Thornveck. He was tall even for an orc, broad across the shoulders with a neatly trimmed black beard and eyes that measured everything they saw. When he looked at me, his smile widened, as if I were a joke he had already told. The magistrate called the session to order. Rygar rose first. This so-called marriage, he began. Voice smooth and carrying is nothing but a desperate ruse. They wed in haste with no ceremony, no witnesses of standing, no time for courtship. An orc heiress and a human miller who lives in a leaking hut. The difference in their worlds is laughable. This is a sham designed to cheat my grandfather's will and keep the Thornveck Holdings from their rightful heir, me. Murmurs rippled through the hall. Rygar continued, listing every rumor his men had spread. I was a fortune hunter. Kylera had bought me. Our union was false from the first day. Each word was polished, reasonable, and poisonous. Then Kylera stood. She did not shout. She did not plead. She simply spoke the truth. Yes, she said, voice clear and steady. The marriage began out of necessity. I needed a husband before my 29th birthday, or I would lose everything my grandfather built. I went to Edrin Vale because his land borders ours, and because he is known as a man who cannot be bought. I asked him to marry me the same day we met. She paused. The hall had gone completely still, but necessity became something else. She continued. In the weeks that followed, I lived in his house. I woke before dawn and carried water to the fields. I burned stew in his kitchen and laughed when he teased me. I stood beside him in the mud when Rygar's men cut the irrigation pipes. I fought the fire with him when they burned our winter seed. I watched him bleed and still choose to stand with me. He never asked for gold. He never asked for power. He only asked that I live with him as a true wife in the dirt and the smoke in the hard days, and I chose to stay. She turned and looked straight at me. He treated me as an equal when every other man saw only the fortune I carry. That is why this marriage is real. A heavy silence filled the room. Her lawyer stepped forward and laid out the evidence-signed statements from the men Rygar had hired to cut the pipe's records of coin, paid to the arsonist who burned the storehouse letters proving Rygar had pressured merchants to cut me off. The council elders bent their heads together, voices low. I stood then. My voice was rougher than hers, simpler, but I needed them to hear it from me. I am no lord, I said. I am a man who tills his own soil and mends his own mill. I agreed to this marriage because I did not want to watch my land and every farm like it fall into the hands of a man who would burn them for profit. But I stayed because of her, because I have seen her wade through mud in fine boots and still smile when the work is done. because when the fire came, she did not run, she fought beside me. I do not know much about councils or wills, but I know this what began as ink on papers becomes something I will fight for with my own hands. If you take it from her, you take it from both of us. I sat down. My burned shoulder ached, but my hands were steady. The elders conferred only a few minutes more. The head magistrate rose. The council finds the marriage between Edrin Vale and Kaelira Thornvek to be lawful and binding. Lady Kaelira retains full control of the Thornvek holdings. Rygar Thornvek is stripped of any claim, and his actions will be referred to the king's justices for judgment on charges of sabotage and arson. The gavel struck wood like a hammer on an anvil. Rygar's smile died. Kaelira's knees buckled the moment we stepped outside the hall. I caught her before she fell, one arm around her waist. She turned into me and buried her face against my chest, the first time she had ever let anyone see her tremble. I held her there in the corridor while servants and counselors hurried past, pretending not to stare. Her shoulders shook once, then stilled. I thought I would lose everything she whispered against my tunic. "You didn't," I said into her hair. "We didn't." She pulled back just enough to look up at me. Her eyes were wet but shining. Then she rose on her toes and kissed me, not for show, not for witnesses, but because she wanted to. It was brief and fierce and tasted of relief and rain and the future we had just won. We returned to the farm the next day. Kaelira kept the Thornvek holdings, but she moved her most important work to our table by the window. She still traveled when she had to, yet she always came home before dark. I rebuilt the storehouse stronger than before, and she helped carry every beam. We planted the new seed together. The burns on my arm healed into pale scars that she sometimes traced with her fingertips at night. Nearly 1 year later, on the exact anniversary of the day she first stepped from that black carriage and asked a stranger to marry her, we held a second wedding at the farm. No council, no lawyers, no haste. Just our neighbor's old Thomas grinning with his pipe. The goats bleating from the pen strings of wildflowers hung along the fence, and a simple table set under the open sky. We spoke our own vows this time, words we had written together by firelight. When the sun touched the horizon, I stood beside her, her hand in mine, the silver cord long since replaced by a plain band of iron and copper we had forged ourselves. She was no longer the exhausted heiress who needed a husband by tomorrow. I was no longer the solitary miller guarding an empty house. We had begun with a desperate bargain shouted across a dusty yard. We had ended with something quieter and far stronger, two people who had chosen each other through mud and fire and fear, and who would keep choosing each other every morning after. The wind moved through the wheat like a blessing. Kaelira leaned her head on my shoulder. I rested my cheek against her copper hair. And for the first time in my life, the land beneath my feet felt like home. Not because it was mine alone, but because it was ours.